Welcome. I am author D.M. Patterson, and in this video, I am going to show you how our beloved character Jane Bennet from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is in fact a flawed character. In my recent videos, I have been diving into the craft of character, how to create deep and engaging characters your audience will never forget by Mark Boutros. This has been a really insightful book. I highly recommend it. As you can see, I've got lots of tabs and I do have some underlining and notes in here. I don't do this for my books that I enjoy. For example, my Pride and Prejudice book. I would never do anything like that to this book. But when it comes to craft books and books to help me along my journey of writing, I will tab and write and underline. I just want to clarify that I'm not using any of the movies, any of the TV adaptations, any of the books and movies that are based on or loosely based on Pride and Prejudice. I'm sticking straight with the source material. And I am very excited that I did find this Pride and Prejudice adaptation. It looks like this because this has the letters. It has copies of the letters that were written, and somebody hand wrote these letters, and they did research on what the letters would have looked like, and I'll put a picture up. I was really excited to find this copy of Pride and Prejudice, and I really enjoy it. So I'm showing you that I do have a copy of Pride and Prejudice. I'm not going to be reading out of it for my source material. I actually have the quotes that I have on my phone because it's easier to read it off the phone. But I wanted to show this off because I am a giant Jane Austen nerd. I was talking to my sister Danielle the other day, and I said, I loved Jane Austen. I loved her works way before this became really popular. As my siblings and I were growing up, my mom always had a classic novel in her hand. Her favorite is Charles Dickens. She loves a lot of the old British classics, but Charles Dickens is definitely another great author if you want to dive into character developments because Charles Dickens' characters are very unforgettable. One of his most famous, again, one of these old old British classics that keep being redone. There's adaptations after adaptations, there's retellings. It's because the characters are so strong. The Christmas Carol, that was written by Charles Dickens. One of the reasons I think that Jane Austen is still being celebrated today, more than 100 years after the first publication of Pride and Prejudice, is because her characters are so timeless. You can take her characters out of the setting of them being judged for what coach or carriage they're driving in, and you can set them in a setting where the characters are being judged by what car they're driving. And the story itself will not change that much. What is so beloved about the the process and the growth of especially Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, that in and of itself is transcends the time that it was set in. So I think that is why we are still seeing so much resurgence and love for Jane Austen, and particularly her work Pride and Prejudice. When I finished reading this book, I wanted to give an example. I wanted to go back through on my channel and give an example of a literary character and break it down for specifically show you a character flaw based on what Mark writes in how he breaks down his character flaws. Now, Mark does provide a lot of examples in his book, but because he is a screenwriter, I'm assuming that this is why he uses a lot of movie characters or TV characters. So what I wanted to do, what I thought would be a fun exercise, is going back through using what Mark says about specifically about the character flaw and apply it to a literary character that is well known. It came down to Ebenezer Scrooge from The Christmas Carol, written by Charles Dickens, or I was originally thinking either Elizabeth Bennet or Mr. Darcy from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. For the character Ebenezer Scrooge, we have Tiny Tim, who is there to provide a very stark contrast to Ebenezer's character. Tiny Tim is seen as very angelic almost. He is very patient, he is very kind, and he is very accepting of the fact that whatever illness that he has is keeping him from having a long life. He is set up as very, very high, very almost sinless. And it's to provide a very stark contrast to Ebenezer's greed, in so much that Tiny Tim's life is literally tied to whether or not Ebenezer has his redemption arc. It's a very, very obvious, very stark contrast. And when I was thinking about Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, I don't really think, because at first I was thinking, oh, they're stark contrasts to each other, and they provide that play off of each other like Tiny Tim and Ebenezer Scrooge. That's not necessarily true. They're not that starkly different from each other. And then I thought, well, Jane Bennet. Jane Bennet is almost set up as that angelic character that all the other characters are almost compared to. As I started thinking more about Jane Bennet's character, I got kind of frustrated because I thought that Jane Bennet's character was pretty flat at first. When I first started looking at the characters based on Mark's book, I thought, Jane Bennet kind of falls into the same category as Tiny Tim, where they have to pretty much be flat and the epitome of what all the other characters should be. Fortunately, Jane's life does not depend on whether the antagonist's character accepts their redemption arc or not, but we do see that Jane's happiness is very closely tied to whether the antagonist accepts their redemption arc. So at first, I thought it would be a little difficult to set up Jane's character really as anything that had any kind of arc or had any kind of flaw, because my initial thinking was Jane was pretty much set up the same as Tiny Tim. So I'm going to give you some examples of why I thought this. If you have not read the book, though, if you have seen any of the adaptations, I think you will still very much be able to follow along and understand what I'm trying to point out. I am going to make all the spoilers because I need to show her progression throughout the story, and I can't do that without spoiling what happens. So here is my spoiler alert. If you have not seen any of the adaptations, if you have not read the book, but you want to be able to look at any of the adaptations or read any of the adaptations without any spoilers, please come back to this once you have completed that. And hopefully, once you've come back to this, you'll see it in a different light. Here are some descriptions that the characters themselves have to say about Jane Bennet. Mr. Bingley describes her as the most beautiful creature he has ever beheld. She is described as a sweet girl by Mr. Bingley's sisters. Mr. Darcy thinks that she smiles too much. Mr. Darcy could have immediately focused on how Miss Jane Bennet is not worthy of, and she's not in the same social circles. She's not in their league. It's very easy for Mr. Darcy to have picked up on something a little bit more obvious than that. So at first, Mr. Darcy's just criticism of she smiles too much, it seems more of, at first, it's supposed to be painted as more of a view that Mr. Darcy is very arrogant. This comment that Mr. Darcy has seems very superficial at first, but we're going to dive into this. So Jane's mother constantly focuses on Jane's beauty. She doesn't really have a whole lot else to say about Jane. She's very focused on the fact that Jane is the prettiest girl and that Jane's beauty is often praised by everyone who's around. And then we have Mr. Bennet, so Jane's dad. Mr. Bennet does not spend a whole lot of time building up Jane. Elizabeth is very clearly his favorite daughter. It's to the point where when in the book, Mr. Bingley's sisters and Mr. Darcy work to bring Mr. Bingley away from Jane because they don't think that they make a good match. The real deep heartbreak that Jane experiences, Mr. Bennet does not even, he doesn't seem to care. He just makes a sarcastic remark about, well, every girl wants to be crossed in love every now and then, and he doesn't build her up, and he doesn't really focus on Jane at all. That's another character development video. But so we have the Bingley sisters saying that she's a sweet girl and they wouldn't mind getting to know her, but they don't see her as an equal match. Anybody that Mr. Bingley, their brother, should marry. Mr. Bingley is immediately enthralled by her beauty. Her mother is constantly focused on her beauty and no other attributes. Her dad is sarcastic about the two like major things that happen, her getting sick and Mr. Bingley leaving her. He doesn't really care, he shows sarcasm. But for the most part, the other characters in the novel are just talking about how sweet and how kind she is. She is loved by her nieces and nephews. Now, specifically, I'm going to read you more interactions between Jane Bennet and Elizabeth Bennet to show you what Elizabeth thinks about Jane. In chapter 4, Elizabeth is talking to Jane after the ball, and this is the very important ball where the characters of Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley, and his two sisters are introduced. And in the ball, Mr. Bingley asks Jane to dance with him a second time. In the context of balls back then, if a man were to ask a woman to dance with him again, he's showing preference, and this is a big deal. So Jane is saying that she was surprised that Mr. Bingley would even consider, wanting to dance with her again. And Elizabeth is saying, "Oh, well, of course he would ask you again. He could not help but seeing that you were 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that." So after Elizabeth kind of gives her little joke about, well, yeah, he doesn't have to be a gentleman to realize that you're beautiful, she says, "Well, he certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him. You have liked many a stupider person." And Jane says, "Dear Lizzie." And Elizabeth says, "Oh, you're a great deal too apt, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. All the world are good and agreeable in your eyes. I never heard of you speak ill of a human being in my life." So Elizabeth is putting Jane on this pedestal of saying, you love everyone and you don't speak ill of anybody. And Jane's response is, "I would wish not to be hasty in censuring anyone, but I always speak what I think." So Jane's coming back and saying, well, I don't want to hastily judge anyone, but when I do say something, I mean it. So Elizabeth's response is, "I know you do. That is what makes the wonder, with your good sense, to be honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. Affection of candor is common enough. One meets with it everywhere. But to be candid, without the ostentation or design, to take the good of everybody's character and to make it still better, and say nothing of the bad, belongs to you alone." So not only is Jane obstinate against saying anything bad about somebody, she is somehow she's somehow interpreting that person's character to make them even better. But Elizabeth points her finger at something. She is blind to the follies and nonsense of others. Another word for that is naive. Jane is very naive. And this is where I start thinking that's not necessarily a good thing. They go on to discuss Mr. Bingley's sisters, and this is really important because Elizabeth says that the sisters really aren't that nice. Mr. Bingley's sisters aren't that nice. And immediately Jane comes to their defense and says, "Certainly not at first, but they are very pleasing women when you converse with them." Well, they're not nice at first, but when you talk to them, they're good conversationalists. And in the book, as Elizabeth gets to know the Bingley's sisters, she does say that they're really good at talking. They're really good at getting a conversation going. But they're also, when their back is turned, they will tear you to shreds if they don't like you. So Jane is a perfect example of Jane picking out. Well, they're great at conversation. But Elizabeth is saying, "Yep, you're focusing on that. You're focusing that you want to see them in a good light. And they were great when they talked to you." But later we see that these women, they were, because they're in society and because they're in high society, they were taught to have really great conversational skills without really saying a whole lot. And then as soon as they are out of your sight, they're going to tear you apart. That naivety that is so praised in James Bennet's character is really not that great. And that's where Mark comes in. So I'm going to take a little bit of a sidetrack here, and I'm going to go back to what Mark says about character flaws. This is in chapter 2.4, Character and Personality Traits, on page 96. A character trait becomes a flaw when it is a weakness that prevents the character from getting what they want, informed by a past trauma or event. So based on what Mark says about a character's flaw, it can be something as incredibly subtle as the naivety of Jane Bennet's character, because it does ultimately get in the way of what Jane wants. What does Jane want? Jane wants to marry Mr. Bingley. Even this criticism, when it is said towards the very beginning of the book, of Jane smiling too much, even that criticism is seen as very odd, and it's not really taken very seriously by the reader, because Mr. Darcy is the one who says it. And Mr. Darcy, it kind of offends everyone. He walks into the ball and offends everybody. So we immediately dismiss the fact that Mr. Darcy, who later on in the book we understand is actually a very good judge of character, Mr. Darcy's comment about her smiling too much seems more of a reflection of him and his not being able to make anyone happy, and he's not caring what anybody thinks about him, as opposed to actually pointing out almost immediately the flaw in Jane. Now, how does her flaw get in the way of marrying Mr. Bingley? I'm glad you asked.